The lights of Lancaster's, one of the most prestigious restaurants in New York City, gleamed like jewels, casting a golden glow over the bustling crowd inside. The restaurant was a hotspot for the city's elite. Business magnates, socialites, and celebrities often dined here, savoring the world-class cuisine and luxurious ambiance. Veronica Blake stepped out of a sleek black limousine onto the red carpet that led to the restaurant's entrance. Her long, designer gown shimmered under the lights, and her diamond necklace caught the attention of the paparazzi lingering nearby. Veronica exuded confidence, her every movement deliberate and commanding. Her entourage followed close behind, a mix of her closest friends and admirers, all eager to bask in her aura. Inside, the restaurant was alive with the soft hum of conversations, the clinking of fine crystal glasses, and the distant melody of a live pianist. Rachel Carter, a young waitress working her second shift of the day, adjusted her uniform and took a deep breath. At 22, Rachel was juggling 2 jobs to save for college tuition. Her dreams of becoming a writer were her guiding light, even during grueling 14-hour days like this one. As Veronica entered, heads turned. She smiled coolly, acknowledging the attention as though it were her due. Her friends laughed at her witticisms about the decor and the other patrons, their voices cutting through the air like knives. Rachel noticed the group from across the room and groaned inwardly. She had heard of Veronica Blake. Her reputation for being difficult was well known among the staff. Rachel grabbed her notepad and approached the table. "Good evening, and welcome to Lancaster's. My name is Rachel, and I'll be your server tonight. May I start you off with something to drink?" Veronica barely glanced at her, too engrossed in recounting an elaborate story about her recent vacation to the French Riviera. When Rachel politely repeated the question, Veronica turned her sharp gaze toward her. "Isn't it obvious we're still deciding?" she said coldly. Her friend smirked, and Rachel felt a flush creep up her neck. Across the room, Jonathan Lancaster, the restaurant's enigmatic owner, sat at a discreet corner table. He often dined anonymously to observe his staff and ensure the restaurant maintained its impeccable standards. Tonight, his sharp eyes landed on Veronica's table, watching as the interaction between Rachel and the socialite unfolded. Rachel returned to the kitchen, her nerves fraying. She whispered a silent prayer for patience as she prepared to take the table's order again. Balancing a tray of waters, she approached Veronica's group with a forced smile. "Have you had a chance to look over the menu?" she asked, keeping her tone cheerful. Veronica leaned back in her chair, inspecting Rachel as if she were a specimen under a microscope. "I'll have the Wagyu steak, medium rare," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "But tell the chef not to ruin it like the last time I was here. And bring it quickly. I'm not in the mood to wait." Rachel bit her tongue and nodded, scribbling down the order. One of Veronica's friends added, "Make sure the wine is chilled properly this time. Last time, it was practically warm." "I'll take care of it right away," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the knot tightening in her stomach. As she turned to leave, Veronica's voice stopped her in her tracks. "Oh, and dear, try to look a little more professional. Your posture is dreadful, and your hair's a mess." Laughter erupted from the table, and Rachel felt the sting of humiliation. She clenched her fists, willing herself not to cry. Nearby diners exchanged uncomfortable glances, their murmurs blending with the background noise. Jonathan's eyes narrowed as he observed the scene. He leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. He had always taken pride in treating his staff like family, and watching Rachel endure Veronica's relentless criticism stirred a protective anger within him. As Rachel delivered the order to the kitchen, she fought to keep her composure. Her coworkers offered her sympathetic looks, but she waved them off, determined to power through. Jonathan discreetly signaled the restaurant manager, leaning in to whisper a few words. Back at the table, Veronica reveled in the attention of her friends, unaware of the storm brewing. Rachel returned to the kitchen, her heart pounding as she tried to steady her shaking hands. The laughter from Veronica's table still echoed in her ears, a cruel reminder of her powerless position. The head chef, a burly man named Marco with a kind heart, noticed her distress. "You okay, Rachel?" he asked gruffly, his tone laced with concern. She forced a smile and nodded. "Just another tough customer. I'll be fine." Marco frowned, but didn't press further, not knowing Rachel's resilience. She prepared Veronica's steak with extra care, double-checking every detail to avoid further criticism. As she carried the plate back to the table, her stomach churned. When Rachel approached Veronica's table, the conversation abruptly stopped. Veronica's sharp eyes fixed on her like a predator spotting prey. "About time," she said, tapping her diamond-encrusted watch for emphasis. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten about us." Rachel set the plate down carefully in front of Veronica, her voice steady. "Here's your Wagyu steak, cooked medium rare, as requested. I hope you enjoy it." Veronica didn't even glance at Rachel as she picked up her fork and knife. She cut into the steak and took a small bite. A dramatic pause followed as she chewed, her expression unreadable. Then she set her utensils down with an exaggerated sigh. "This is unacceptable," Veronica declared loudly, her voice carrying across the dining room. Heads turned as diners paused their conversations to watch the scene unfold. "It's overcooked. Do you even know what medium rare means?" Rachel's face burned with embarrassment as the other patrons began whispering among themselves. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice tight. "I can have the kitchen prepare another one for you right away." "Don't bother," Veronica snapped. "It's clear that this place has gone downhill, and honestly, I don't expect much from someone who can't even bother to present herself properly." Laughter erupted from Veronica's friends, their mocking tones cutting deeper than any insult. Rachel clenched her fists at her sides, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. She opened her mouth to apologize again, but her voice caught in her throat. From his corner table, Jonathan Lancaster watched the scene with a steely expression. His jaw tightened as he rose from his seat, his tall frame commanding attention even in the crowded restaurant. He walked toward the kitchen, a determined look in his eyes. Rachel retreated to the kitchen, her hands trembling as she placed the rejected plate on the counter. Marco frowned when he saw her. "What happened?" "She said it's overcooked," Rachel murmured, her voice barely audible. Marco cursed under his breath. "That steak was perfect. Who does she think she is?" Rachel shook her head, too exhausted to respond. She grabbed a glass of water and took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. Losing her job wasn't an option. She couldn't afford to let Veronica's cruelty push her over the edge. Meanwhile, at Veronica's table, the socialite basked in her false victory. She sipped her wine with a self-satisfied smirk, oblivious to the growing discomfort among the other diners. Her friends continued to laugh at her sharp remarks, their camaraderie fueled by her scathing wit. But not everyone in the restaurant found her antics amusing. A middle-aged couple at a nearby table exchanged disapproving glances, while a young man seated by the window shook his head in disgust. The murmurs of discontent grew louder, though Veronica remained blissfully unaware. As Veronica reached for her glass of wine, a shadow fell over the table. She looked up, her smirk faltering as Jonathan Lancaster stood before her, his calm yet commanding presence silencing the entire room. "Good evening," Jonathan said, his voice deep and steady. "I trust you're enjoying your meal?" Veronica blinked, momentarily taken aback. "I'm sorry, but who are you?" Jonathan's lips curved into a faint smile. "Jonathan Lancaster. I own this restaurant." A hushed silence fell over the room as everyone turned to watch the interaction. Veronica's confidence wavered, but she quickly recovered, flashing him a dazzling smile. "Ah, Mr. Lancaster. What a pleasure. I was just telling my friends how much I adore this place." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Really? Because from what I've observed, your behavior suggests otherwise." Veronica's smile froze, and the color drained from her face. For the first time that evening, she was at a loss for words. Jonathan glanced at Rachel, who had just emerged from the kitchen, her eyes wide with surprise. "I believe we need to have a conversation," Jonathan said, his gaze returning to Veronica. His tone was polite but firm, leaving no room for argument. Veronica swallowed hard, suddenly realizing that her night was about to take a very different turn. The restaurant had fallen into a hush. All eyes were on Jonathan Lancaster, who stood tall and composed, radiating an air of authority. Veronica, usually so adept at commanding a room, found herself shrinking under his calm but piercing gaze. Jonathan turned to Rachel, his voice soft but audible to those nearby. "Rachel, would you mind stepping aside for a moment? I'd like to address this situation personally." Rachel hesitated, glancing nervously at Veronica and her entourage. But Jonathan gave her an encouraging nod, and she reluctantly stepped back. Her heart raced as she watched from the edge of the room, unsure of what was about to unfold. Jonathan's gaze returned to Veronica. "Ms. Blake, I make it a point to personally ensure that every guest at Lancaster's has an exceptional dining experience. However, that extends beyond just the food and ambiance. It includes the treatment of my staff." Veronica straightened in her seat, trying to regain her composure. "I wasn't aware the owner was observing. If I came across as critical, it's only because I have high standards. Surely you understand." Jonathan's expression didn't waver. High standards are one thing, disrespect is another. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Patrons leaned in closer, eager to catch every word. Veronica's friends shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. "Your conduct tonight," Jonathan continued, his voice firm but even, "has not only embarrassed one of my staff members, but also disrupted the atmosphere for other diners. This is not the kind of behavior we tolerate here at Lancaster's." Veronica's cheeks flushed, the weight of the room's collective judgment pressing down on her. She opened her mouth to respond, but Jonathan held up a hand. "And just to clarify," he added, "Rachel, the waitress you humiliated, is my niece." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Rachel's eyes widened in shock, her hands flying to her mouth. Veronica's jaw dropped, and for the first time, she looked genuinely shaken. "My niece has worked tirelessly to pursue her dreams," Jonathan said, his voice growing warmer as he glanced at Rachel. "She represents the kind of determination and resilience we should all admire, not tear down." The silence in the room was deafening. Veronica's bravado had crumbled entirely, and her friends now looked more embarrassed than amused. Veronica's fingers gripped the edge of the table as if it could anchor her in the middle of the storm. "Mr. Lancaster, I wasn't aware of her relation to you," she stammered, her voice unsteady. Jonathan tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Should that matter? Shouldn't every employee, regardless of who they are, be treated with respect?" Veronica's face burned with shame, but Jonathan didn't allow her a chance to answer. "Rachel, like every member of my team, is here to provide a service, not to endure mockery or disrespect. My staff is the backbone of this establishment, and I stand by them without hesitation." Rachel, still standing at the edge of the room, felt a lump rise in her throat. The quiet strength in Jonathan's words moved her deeply. For the first time that evening, she didn't feel small or powerless. Jonathan turned his attention back to Veronica. "I'd like to propose a solution, Miss Blake," he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "Rather than offering you the complimentary champagne you assumed was coming, I'll be donating the value of your meal to a local charity that supports young women pursuing education." Veronica's mouth opened and closed as she searched for a response, but none came. The entire restaurant erupted in quiet applause, the sound growing louder as patrons showed their approval for Jonathan's stance. Jonathan raised a hand to silence the room, his gaze still fixed on Veronica. "It's my hope," he said, "that this experience will remind you, and all of us, that true class is reflected in how we treat others, not in what we wear or the size of our bank accounts." The applause grew louder, and Veronica sank deeper into her chair, her confidence completely shattered. For the first time, she truly understood the weight of her actions and the consequences they carried. As the applause died down, Jonathan glanced at Rachel and gave her a reassuring nod. She nodded back, a small but genuine smile breaking through her earlier anxiety. The tide had turned, and for the first time that night, Rachel felt like she belonged. Veronica, meanwhile, remained frozen in her seat, the reality of the evening sinking in as she realized she had become the subject of an unforgettable lesson in humility. Veronica sat stiffly at her table, her hands clenched around her silk napkin. The air around her felt heavy, laden with judgment from the other diners and the unshakable weight of Jonathan's words. Her friends, usually so quick to rally behind her, were silent, their eyes avoiding hers, as though her humiliation might somehow rub off on them. Jonathan remained composed, his commanding presence holding the room in a quiet stillness. He motioned to the restaurant manager, who approached with calm efficiency, carrying a sleek black envelope embossed with the Lancaster's logo. "Ms. Blake," Jonathan said, his tone professional but firm, "this contains the receipt for tonight's meal, along with documentation confirming the donation I've made on your behalf to Bright Futures Foundation. They provide scholarships and resources for young women like Rachel who are striving to achieve their dreams. The murmurs in the room grew louder, and a few diners began to applaud softly. Veronica's face turned crimson, her carefully applied makeup unable to conceal the blush of shame. She began, but Jonathan's unwavering gaze silenced her. Accountability is an important part of growth, Miss Blake, Jonathan said. While I can't undo the harm caused tonight, I hope this gesture serves as a reminder that every action has consequences. Veronica swallowed hard, unable to meet his eyes. The reality of her behavior, exposed in such a public and undeniable way, was impossible to ignore. Around the restaurant, the atmosphere shifted. Diners exchanged approving nods and words of encouragement with the waitstaff, and the tension that had filled the room earlier began to dissolve. The staff, who had quietly endured Veronica's tirades for weeks, stood a little taller, emboldened by Jonathan's decisive actions. Rachel, still standing near the edge of the room, felt a swell of emotion rise in her chest. She blinked back tears, her heart full of gratitude for her uncle's unflinching support. For so long, she had endured rude customers with no recourse, but tonight was different. Tonight, she was seen, heard, and valued. Veronica stood abruptly, smoothing her designer dress with trembling hands. "Thank you for clarifying your stance, Mr. Lancaster," she said stiffly. "We'll be leaving now." Jonathan nodded politely, stepping aside as Veronica and her friends gathered their belongings in awkward silence. As they made their way to the exit, the room erupted in applause once more. This time, the sound was louder, more celebratory. A collective acknowledgement of justice served. As the door closed behind Veronica, the applause slowly faded, and the restaurant staff began to move again. Plates clinked, conversations resumed, and the warm hum of Lancasters returned. Rachel wiped her hands on her apron, still processing everything that had just happened. She felt a tap on her shoulder and turned to see Jonathan standing there, his expression soft but serious. "You handled yourself admirably tonight, Rachel," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Her cheeks flushed, and she shook her head. I didn't want to make things worse, but I felt so helpless." Jonathan placed a hand on her shoulder. "You weren't helpless. You were strong. You showed grace and professionalism in a difficult situation, and that's something to be proud of." Tears welled in Rachel's eyes, but this time they weren't from frustration or humiliation. They were from relief and gratitude. She nodded, unable to find the words to express how much his support meant to her. "Thank you, Uncle Jonathan," she whispered. Jonathan smiled. "You've earned it." Nearby, the staff gathered quietly, their admiration for Rachel evident in their eyes. Marco, the head chef, stepped forward and gave her a rare grin. "You're tougher than you look, kid. We've all been rooting for you." Rachel laughed softly, the tension in her chest finally easing. The other waitstaff clapped her on the back, murmuring words of encouragement and praise. But it wasn't just the staff who showed their support. One by one, diners approached Rachel, offering kind words and larger-than-usual tips. An elderly woman with a gentle smile handed Rachel an envelope. "This is for you, dear," the woman said. "Your uncle is right. Grace under pressure is a rare and beautiful thing." Rachel opened the envelope later that night to find a handwritten note and a generous tip. The note read, "To a young woman with a bright future, don't let anyone dim your light." As Rachel returned to her duties, a newfound confidence radiated from her. She no longer felt like a small, unseen cog in the bustling restaurant. She felt like a vital part of something bigger. Jonathan watched her from afar, his heart swelling with pride. Tonight, he had not only defended his niece, but had also sent a powerful message to everyone in the room. Dignity and respect were the true cornerstones of success. Veronica's heels clicked sharply against the polished floors as she and her friends made their way to the door. The applause still echoed faintly in her ears, a stinging reminder of her public humiliation. Her friends trailed behind her, exchanging awkward glances, unsure of how to console her, or if they even should. "Let's just go," Veronica muttered, her voice low but trembling with frustration. The grand confidence she had displayed all evening had completely evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of shame. As they reached the valet stand outside, Veronica turned to her friends, searching for support. That man completely overreacted. I was just giving honest feedback about the service, she said defensively, her tone betraying the fragility of her argument. Her closest friend Amanda hesitated before responding. Veronica, maybe it's not just about tonight. You've been really critical lately. Sometimes people need kindness more than honesty. Veronica's head snapped toward Amanda, shock and betrayal flashing across her face. You're siding with them? She demanded. Amanda raised her hands, palms up, in a gesture of peace. I'm just saying, maybe it wouldn't hurt to reflect on what happened. That's all. The valet arrived with their cars, breaking the tense moment. Veronica's friends exchanged hurried goodbyes and drove off, leaving her standing alone in the cool night air. She wrapped her arms around herself, the weight of the evening pressing down on her like never before. As she slid into the back seat of her luxury sedan, Veronica couldn't stop Jonathan's words from replaying in her mind. True class is reflected in how we treat others, not in what we wear or the size of our bank accounts. For the first time, she felt a small crack in the armor of her pride, the faintest hint of self-awareness creeping in. Her driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror. Rough night, ma'am? He asked politely. Veronica didn't respond. She stared out the window, the bustling streets of the city blurring into streaks of light. For the first time in years, she had nothing to say. Inside Lancaster's, the atmosphere had completely transformed. The warmth and camaraderie that had been missing earlier in the evening now filled the air. Diners smiled at one another, some still murmuring about Jonathan's bold stance, while others simply enjoyed the renewed sense of community. Rachel returned to the floor, her head held high and her steps steady. She moved from table to table, thanking patrons for their kind words and gestures of support. Each compliment, each extra tip felt like a small piece of her dignity being restored. At one table, a young couple handed her a handwritten card. We just wanted to say how inspiring you were tonight, the woman said with a smile. We've been coming here for years, and this is the first time we've truly seen how much heart this place has. Rachel thanked them, tucking the card into her apron pocket. Every gesture, no matter how small, reminded her that she was more than the insults Veronica had hurled at her. She was strong, capable, and deserving of respect. From his spot near the kitchen, Jonathan watched the evening unfold with quiet satisfaction. He had always believed in running his business with integrity, but tonight had reaffirmed why he held that belief so deeply. As the night wound down, Jonathan called Rachel over to his table. You did more than just endure tonight, Rachel, he said warmly. You set an example for everyone here. Never forget how strong you are. Rachel smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you, Uncle Jonathan. Jonathan shook his head. You had it in you all along. I just reminded you of what you're capable of. The restaurant staff gathered around as Jonathan raised his glass. To Rachel, he said, his voice filled with pride, and to everyone here who makes Lancaster's more than just a restaurant. You are what makes this place special. The staff and patrons joined in the toast, the clinking of glasses ringing out like a harmonious melody. The night ended not in discord, but in unity, a shared celebration of resilience, kindness, and respect. As Rachel walked home that night, the city lights glowing softly around her, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her dreams of college and a brighter future no longer felt so far away. And while Veronica's departure marked the end of one chapter, the lessons she had learned, along with everyone else in that restaurant, would linger far beyond the evening. True wealth, Rachel thought, wasn't about money or status. It was about compassion, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what was right. And in that moment, she knew she was richer than she had ever realized. The events of that night at Lancaster's became a story shared far beyond the walls of the restaurant. For those who witnessed it, it was more than just an uncomfortable confrontation. It was a powerful reminder of the values that often go overlooked in a world focused on appearances. Rachel continued to work at Lancaster's, but now with a confidence that resonated in her every action. Her coworkers admired her strength, and the patrons treated her with a new level of respect. Inspired by her uncle's support, Rachel began to take evening classes, determined to build the future she had dreamed of. For Jonathan, the night reaffirmed his belief that leadership wasn't just about running a successful business, but about fostering a culture of dignity and kindness. He saw his restaurant not only as a place for fine dining, but as a space where values could be lived and shared. As for Veronica, the lesson stayed with her. Though the road to change was long, the experience left an indelible mark on her. She avoided Lancaster's for months, but when she finally returned, it wasn't with the air of entitlement she once carried. This time, she came alone, quietly offering a heartfelt apology to Rachel. It wasn't easy, but it was a start. Life went on, but the ripple effects of that night endured. Lancaster's became more than a restaurant. It became a symbol of the idea that no matter where we come from or what we do, everyone deserves respect. And for Rachel, it marked the beginning of a journey toward a future she knew she could shape with her own hands. In the end, the story wasn't about a single evening or a single confrontation. It was about the power of humility, the strength in standing up for what's right, and the quiet resilience of those who refuse to let adversity define them. True wealth, as Rachel and Jonathan both learned, lies not in riches or status, but in the simple, profound act of treating others with kindness. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story. We hope it left you with a powerful message about kindness, respect, and the strength of standing up for what's right. If you enjoyed this story and it resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up. Your support helps us bring more meaningful and inspiring stories to life. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new video. We've got plenty more heartwarming and thought-provoking content coming your way. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story inspired you, share it with your friends and family to spread the message. Thank you once again for being part of our community. Until next time, take care and remember, kindness always wins.